Good?
We're good. Let's do this thing.
Okay. Rocking and rolling?
Rocking and rolling.
Well, Christian, good to be recording with you again. It feels like it's been a minute.
It does feel like it's been a minute.
You went somewhere, right?
Yeah, we did a little long Memorial Day weekend with some friends. Went down to Sun River right outside of Bend, Oregon.
Yeah.
So that was good. It's always funny listening back to these when I'm editing them, because it's usually like a month later when they finally release. And so for our listeners, they're probably like, Memorial Day? I was like 2 months ago.
Memorial Day? Wasn't that last year?
Yeah. But, you know, for us, it was a couple days ago.
Yeah.
Yep.
Did you get to go tubing on the river or in a lake or somewhere? Some body of water?
No, we didn't do any tubing. We did a little, leisurely biking, into the village. Ate lunch at the brewery there. Had our dog Scout with us, and so he was a champ. I mean, he's only a 40-pound, 1-year-old puppy.
Perfect.
And we all took bikes, and he, ran alongside us the whole way. It was almost like 8 miles. So,
wow.
I mean, he was tuckered out for a couple of days afterwards, but he did good. And we did go down to Crater Lake, which is almost to California. It was still a ways away.
Yeah.
But it was well worth it. It was beautiful. Apparently, it's the deepest lake in North America.
It beats Lake Tahoe?
Yeah, it's like 1,800 feet deep or something.
Wow.
Yeah, it's deep.
You'd think the deepest lake in North America would have like somewhere been over in the land of 10,000 lakes or land of lakes or whatever.
Sure. No, but this, I'm not sure. Well, because this, by its name, was a volcano crater. So kind of like
right.
Mount St. Helens. It used to have a top, and now it's just a massive
blew its
crater.
top, and now it's full of water.
Yeah, now it's full of water, which it doesn't have any lakes or anything coming into it.
Okay.
But apparently it's like 6 miles across.
Jeez.
So it's good size.
Okay.
I think, for comparison, it's about the same, I believe, about the same shoreline as like Lake Washington.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
so like 25 miles around. Yeah.
For all you viewers and listeners, Lake Washington, go look it up on a map.
It's massive.
Google it.
It's huge.
It's huge.
It's huge.
So, obviously being down in Crater Lake, you brought something back.
I did.
Yeah.
Brought back some Crater Lake straight American rye whiskey.
Ooh, and this is a whiskey I have not had, but it looks like it's been aged 0 years.
Two
years. Sorry,
2 years. It's fairly young, but it has a good flavor to it, I think.
It's not as spicy, or maybe that's because of the ice I have in it, but it's not as spicy as I would have expected, especially with it being 100% rye.
Yeah.
And then we got some, you're just treating me today. It's like, we got some whiskey.
It's my turn.
It's your turn? Okay. We've got some, what are we smoking?
It's a good question. I took off the wrapper here. It is Independica. Independicia? I don't know. 1898. It's Philippines? I don't know. I don't speak the Spanish, but it's delicious.
You don't speak the Spanish.
I think it's a Dominican cigar because I got a Dominican sampler and this was in it. So
this
makes sense.
Is it from Thompson Cigar Club?
Yes. Yep. All my cigars from Thompson Cigar Club.
Unofficially, big thank you to Thompson Cigar Club. Appreciate it. And Crater Lake, we also appreciate the whiskey, even though you didn't give it to us. But
we're open to it.
But maybe we can make that
We're
change.
open to it.
Yeah, we are open to it.
Yep. Check out the Denim and Whiskey.
Yeah, check out D&W.
Yep. On the Insta.
On the Instas. That reminds me, I always do this at the end, but maybe I need to bookend it. Feel free to check us out on the socials, Instagram and Facebook. I think we're actually putting together a web page, or it's already put together.
Oh yeah, it's on my to-do list. I should probably do that sometime.
Christian might have a heavier to-do list than I do. My job oftentimes is bringing whiskey and cigars and a warm body to the conversation.
And a sharp mind.
And I suppose a sharp mind.
Sharper tongue.
And a sharper tongue. But Christian, he's the magic behind this thing. He edits it. He puts all the show notes in. He has the podcast experience. He makes the magic happen.
I make it happen.
You make the magic
It's
happen.
primarily because my memory is so bad that I rarely remember what we actually say on these podcasts. So when I go back and edit it, I actually get the edification of whatever wisdom.
Well, that was a really good point that Christian made, or I made.
Whatever wisdom or folly, depending on the episode.
It's mostly wisdom.
Hopefully. That's what we're going for.
Well, we are going to jump into what I think is a heavy topic. It's going to be somewhat abbreviated because My wife is out of town, and I need to take care of kiddos, so they are busy for the next roughly hour or so, but I have to be going soon. So we're going to try and keep this to a tight 30 minutes. And ready?
Go.
Set, go. All right, go.
Yeah.
We are the Old-Fashioned Dad Podcast, seeking to love dads and men through the person and work of Jesus Christ, while entering into tough conversations on marriage, mental health, sex, and parenting, all while sipping good whiskey. So, Christian, I thought today we could talk about trauma. And I thought that would be, it's a topic that ever since the inception of this show, or as the Just Thinking broadcast calls themselves, broadcast, since the inception of this broadcast, this is a topic that I've wanted to talk about for a long time, but have never really known how it would naturally, organically come up on this show.
Sure.
And I've wanted to touch on it, and I didn't bring a lot of strong data to support me, but I did bring my experience. And so I'll be speaking from trauma today, mostly on a personal level, and I'll try and offer up some professional stuff as well. Hopefully wrap it all in a nice gospel burrito. Burrito, right?
Like tacos better, but
nice gospel taco.
Yeah.
And it'll be delectable. So you're familiar with the word trauma?
Yeah, I am. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and you're, I mean, being a military personnel. Do we say personnel? Individual? Whatever.
Yep.
Trauma is pretty commonplace with veterans and service members, right?
Sure. I mean, you've got the medical trauma, or PTSD style, inducing trauma. So yeah, it's a common topic. Yep.
So I knew I definitely know you have experience with trauma, but I wanted to ask that simply to kind of maybe tee up for our listeners and viewers, maybe for them to ask the questions. Hey, am I familiar with trauma? What is trauma? Now, I would be hard pressed to believe that most people in America have not encountered somebody with trauma or experienced some level of trauma in their life. It seems
Sure.
to be fairly pervasive.
So, I mean, I guess it might be helpful to offer a definition. My default is making jokes about everything. So hopefully I won't make an off-colored joke today. But
make an off-color joke, because I think it'll be greatly appreciated.
But I mean, I was kind of thinking, because I think traditionally we understand what trauma is. You're in combat, you see a best friend die, you're abused, sexually, emotionally, something like that. Those are pretty clear definitions of trauma. I don't know if it'd be helpful to, because I've also heard as of late, socially there's, microaggressions and, micro traumas, and like you said, something that hurts my feelings, I'm traumatized, I have PTSD. It seems like anyone can kind of claim, I've got PTSD now. I'm traumatized because someone said something that I don't like.
Well, brother, you're going exactly where I was headed.
Okay.
And I appreciate you jumping right in there, because you always keep me on my toes. So the way that I'm kind of thinking about this, because I absolutely do want to get into kind of a definition of trauma, or at least offer some definitions.
Okay.
So the way that I kind of want to think about this conversation, and hopefully it's helpful for you listeners, is kind of in 4 sections, like what is trauma, why does trauma happen, and since we are a Bible-believing, Jesus-loving, dad-caring podcast, we also want to be asking the questions about where's God in the trauma, and then as Christians, because we're Christians and we're named Christian, we want to be looking at, well, what's our response to trauma, like a Christian, godly response. And to those that are not Christians, hopefully what we say will make sense, even if you don't necessarily believe it.
Sure.
But so let's start with kind of what is trauma. Now, I wanted to look up just an internet definition to see, like, if somebody Googled trauma, what would they get? Mm-hmm. And so what I Googled, and it's coming from the online Oxford Dictionary, a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, right?
Sounds about right.
Yeah, it sounds about right, sure. Now,
which I guess by definition could vary depending on someone's constitution and, mental,
You're
where they're at mentally, I guess.
You're getting to a point that I will address in a little bit. But
Keep getting ahead of you, sorry.
No, I like it. You're right there with me. See, I knew you would have some things to say.
Okay.
So that's kind of an internet definition. Well, I don't disagree with it. It's fairly broad.
Sure.
And you could apply it to almost anything, really. It's somewhat subjective. So, okay. Now, what's a clinical definition? So I don't know if people know this, our listeners know this, or you know this, but there's trauma, and then there's post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay? Now, trauma happens for a variety of reasons, and then sometimes, depending on how intense the trauma is, what can happen or develop is PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay? But sometimes people they talk about these terms, PTSD and trauma, very interchangeably. Like, I was at a grocery store, I had a bad interaction with somebody, it was very traumatic, I feel like I have PTSD.
Sure, I was triggered and...
Yeah, they use a lot of pop psychology buzzwords to say, hey, I'm really shaken up, or I had this bad experience. So a clinical definition of PTSD, so let's go with that, right? We're not anchoring down on this, I'm just giving you a definition. A condition of persistent mental and emotional stress occurring as a result of injury or severe psychological shock, typically involving disturbance of sleep, constant vivid recall of the experience with dulled responses to others and to the outside world.
Well, that's a lot more specific.
That is a lot more specific. So, and that's obviously, you're picking up on, you got the internet definition very, very broad.
Sure.
Very broad, and you've got the clinical PTSD definition, very specific. And this is a definition that you can find if you so choose on the internet. But I would encourage you, if you really want to, read it from the DSM-5, the American Psychological Association Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental and Mood Disorders, 5th edition.
Yeah, I've got that on my bookshelf.
Yeah, I know, right? You read it every day. You're texting me, hey, I got this. So
you probably do have a copy, being a clinical psychologist.
I do have a copy.
Yeah.
I do have a copy. I use it very frequently, so it's very ragged.
Okay. Is that your official title, clinical psychologist, or?
Clinical psychologist would be somebody who has a doctorate. I'm a step below that, so I'm a clinical psychotherapist.
Well, in my book, you're a step above that. Okay.
Sweet.
Okay, buddy.
I will be Dr. Bring Off to you all day long.
All right.
Okay, so now here's where I think you were going. Kind of getting ahead before I got into the definitions, is that trauma, this word trauma, is so commonplace today.
It's thrown around pretty loosely these days.
Right? Don't you feel like it? I feel like where I encounter it the most, apart from my office, is on social media. Somebody said such and such words. That's traumatic. I literally feel like I'm shaking.
Sure. Their words injured me.
Yeah, and it's creating, what we're to believe is, if we, it's a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. So based off of the internet definition, a deeply distressing or disturbing experience, that's very subjective, and it's left to anybody's interpretation.
Sure. Well, and I think in this cultural space we're in now, it's very intentionally designed so that you're not allowed to question someone else's experience or claimed victimhood.
Right. And so what's happening now is, if everything's traumatic, then is anything traumatic? Right. Nothing's really traumatic. But the bigger problem with this is that when bad experiences, say at a grocery store, or maybe bad interactions within a relationship that really don't meet the qualifications or criteria for PTSD, people start saying, well, that's trauma to me, because we live in a culture that says, well, this is my interpretation and your interpretation is
my
wrong.
Truth, that's your truth.
Yeah, right. They kind of get very, they take a lot of latitude with that. But the problem with this is then that, what do you do and how do you identify actual true trauma?
Sure.
And what do you do when you encounter it? And would you know what it is if you did encounter it? If you're saying that the grocery store incident is traumatic, well, what happens when you meet somebody that witnessed a kid that witnessed a murder?
Sure. No, it's kind of the classic issue we're coming up against in so many different sectors of life right now. Kind of there's a range, right? There's the I'm annoyed or inconvenienced or that was an unpleasant experience, and then there's trauma. They're not the same. Like,
right.
Just because you're inconvenienced doesn't mean you're traumatized. And on the other end, someone who maybe is legitimately traumatized, there's also kind of and I'm sure there's some term for it in psychology, but kind of the idea of downplaying it. Like, well, my trauma's not as bad as someone who experienced this, therefore I shouldn't really be feeling this way.
Yeah.
Kind of the dismissal. So you kind of the two extremes of like redefining language so it doesn't mean anything by calling anything that's unpleasant traumatic, and then those who have experienced it downplaying it like, well, yeah, my trauma wasn't as bad as this other person I know that had something worse happen, and so I shouldn't get any attention for this. This isn't a big deal.
Yeah, and unfortunately, and I've seen this more specifically in my office, is there are people out there that they like to use the word trauma because they understand that it will garner attention.
Sure.
That it will make them feel validated.
Do humans like attention? Do they like feeling validated?
I'm not sure. Maybe we should
do
another episode on. Yeah, gosh. Human beings are some of the most selfish bastards on the place.
I know. I hate them.
Planet.
Ugh,
the worst.
Humans.
They're the worst.
The worst.
So I think I like where I'm kind of leaving that particular piece. Like, hey, these are some operational definitions, and kind of our somewhat cultural observations on the use of the word trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Now, ultimately, where I'm going with this is I want to talk about my own particular trauma and the fact that I'm a guy that's experienced this particular brand of trauma. But I'll get to that point after this. So why does trauma happen? Any thoughts?
Sin.
Whoa.
Is this a trick question?
Dude, we are on point today.
I mean, that seems like a really softball.
No-brainer?
Yeah, softball question there.
Why does sin happen? Why does trauma happen? Sin. Right?
Yep.
But to our maybe non-Christian viewers and non-Christian listeners, what do you think their response would be?
I mean, I think, thinking outside of the Christian nomenclature, I would say, trauma happens when one person violates another person's rights, their freedom. They abuse someone, whether intentionally or unintentionally. I'd say most of the time it's probably intentionally in a traumatic situation. I mean, I'm just thinking off the top of my head with situations that I consider traumatic. There's not a lot of them that are like, oh, I accidentally traumatized you. Sorry.
Yeah. Well,
I guess like war could be,
or a natural disaster.
Or a natural disaster, yeah, something where there's, a shock to, like, how you experience the world and how you understand the world.
Yeah, and I think when I asked you, like, hey, how do you think a non-believer, non-Christian would answer the word trauma? Like, what, why does trauma happen? I think you struggled, and I would struggle with that too, because I think actually people who don't believe in God, like they're not Christians, I think they really do struggle to make sense of why trauma happens. Because like they don't have a doctrine of sin that informs them. Like and
Sure.
When you have a doctrine of sin, there's a belief that, hey, look, there is no such thing as good people. Like we're born sinners.
Sure.
And as sinners, we are bad.
So, I mean, I guess another way to frame it in more culturally appropriate terms might be like, why do bad things happen to good people? Why did bad things happen in the world? Because that's how I hear it a lot. And I've even heard of some Christians who like stop being Christians because they're like they just they didn't have proper doctrine or vocabulary or worldview to account for the atrocities in the world. Which to me seems like a weird response, because Christianity and Scripture does have an answer to that, while the rest of the world doesn't.
Right, and I think that those examples that you're giving, the people that Christians that stop being Christians because of all the why is God allowing this bad to happen? Because there's a
Sure. If God was real, then there wouldn't be sin or
right.
hurt
And
or
it's a
whatever.
misunderstanding of
Right.
like how God works, and it's a misunderstanding of even man's responsibility.
Yeah.
So I'll keep talking. So ultimately, and I mean, and this is where I land, is that all trauma is a result of sin. All trauma is a result of sin, and so I have to go back to some of my show notes here, which I get that it sounds a bit reductionistic, but if you're a Christian, and we're double Christians.
We're Christian squared.
That's right.
Yep.
You want to understand this. You need to know that sin has infected and affected everything around us.
Yeah.
The entire world. It was not God that introduced sin into the world.
Right.
Right. It was human beings, and you can go find that in Genesis chapter 3. So we introduced corruption, we introduced death, we introduced darkness and brokenness into God's perfect world. And so, God's under no obligation, right, to save us. He's under no obligation to save us from bad things that might happen
From ourselves.
Yeah, he's under no obligation to do that. But I think when people say that, why do bad things happen, to good people? There's a misunderstanding of, well, what is actually a good person and who actually, is doing the bad things.
Right. I mean, because we haven't really broken this down, theologically, but I mean, the whole idea of the reason that sin and evil is able to thrive in the world is because of free choice, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, if God had created us as humans, just like the animals where we were just instinctual and didn't have cognitive abilities, we would be unable to be in a relationship with God. And it doesn't really work we'll just use the father-son, daughter analogy. How, if God is the father, creates, us as humans, or Adam and Eve, and force them, by default to love him and obey him as a default, well, that's not really love then if it's mandated, right?
It's just being programmed.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you really need free will in order to have true love, in order to have true affection, true desires, and then that brings in the potential for sin, which is what happened, which is what causes the evil in the world. So, God could have removed it, but then we'd just be a bunch of robots.
Right.
And in which case, there's not really a relationship there. I mean, if I, buy a wife from Russia, and she has to be married to me to be able to stay here, and that's what she really cares about. And I'm not going to tell her that. I'm terrible with analogies, but the point is, if basically they had, the person that I loved or was in a relationship with was forced to reciprocate that, but it wasn't on their free will, what's that?
I think that's actually a good illustration, because I think what you were trying to say there is with mail order brides, the person that's buying, in this case a man, buying a bride, is oftentimes like, hey, I'm gonna get companionship or sex, or
sure, there's an exchange of goods.
There's an exchange of goods out of it, and oftentimes the bride on the other end is getting the green card.
Right.
Is getting the citizenship.
Right.
So
she's not looking for love. She's looking for a way into America.
I mean, it's entirely possible. I don't think
it could happen. Sure.
Yeah, that it could happen. I don't think that it's highly likely that it happens.
Right.
But I think that's a good illustration. So I think that God created us with the ability to choose, but it doesn't mean that He's not overall and He's not sovereign. And I think a good book that really touches on that is a book by J.I. Packer, Knowing God. Really thick,
yep.
meaty theological book, but really getting into that idea of predestination and free will,
yep.
God's sovereignty, man's responsibility. I know Tim Keller, and everybody else under the sun.
You know Tim Keller? That's amazing.
Me too.
I mean, I wish I knew him. Seems like a good guy.
So what we have here is, we're talking about trauma being the result of sin, right? In that it's people that are introducing sin into the world, and it's largely, and this is what I encounter in my office, personally and professionally, is that it's people that are creating this kind of traumatic carnage in other people's lives. You know,
Sure,
natural disasters, stuff that really is not necessarily created by people, although,
Sure.
you know, there's the progressive left that might say that tornadoes and hurricanes now are created because of our, you know, pollution and stuff like that. But there's been a lot of natural disasters long before our climate is where it's at.
Yeah. I mean, climate's always been changing, so you know,
Climate always changes.
Pretty convenient to change it from global warming to climate change.
It's kind of an inconvenient truth.
Definitely. We should get Al Gore on the podcast.
Al Gore joined the podcast, and then Bill Gates is next. That'd be a heck of an episode.
That'd be a lineup.
So why does trauma happen? Essentially, I'm saying because of sin.
Sure.
Now, why do specific traumas happen? Well, because I think that people are corrupt and selfish. So when you talk about domestic violence, you know, that's a lot of trauma that happens towards women. That's, you know, and oftentimes the perpetrator of domestic violence are men, our husbands, our fathers. Yeah.
So, I mean, on your last point, not to, you know, don't want you to kind of gloss over it, but you know, it sounds like what you're saying, or the distinction you're trying to make of why it happens, is there's kind of two buckets. There's the event-based one, which might be war or natural disaster, where there's not a specific person that injured them. It's a traumatic event that's faceless. Yeah. Versus, I don't have any numbers, maybe you do, maybe the majority of them, which is one individual committing a sin, a trauma against another person, which you know, obviously there's, you know, and I mean, from what I've read and what I understand, a lot of the times those traumas are done by the people closest to us, not by strangers.
That's absolutely right. And I mean, I didn't bring any numbers with me today, but for any listeners and viewers, you know, the government really does track a lot of these statistics, and so you can go look at censuses from 2008, 2012. Maybe there's been one that's been done more recently, like in 2018 or something. But you can look at that, National Institute for Mental Health, NIMH.org or gov, and NAMI, NAMI.org. They all, I mean, these are all, like, if you want to know numbers, depression, anxiety, mental health, any of this stuff, go check those out. And we'll put that in the show notes.
Sure. Or FBI database for crimes.
Yeah. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
But what you have, going back to my example of, you know, husbands and fathers, men being domestically violent towards their loved ones, and you're absolutely right about that, is that it's oftentimes these types of traumas are perpetrated against those that, you know, by those that are close.
Sure.
And so why does that domestic violence happen? That's a question that is always asked.
Sure.
Why does it happen? Now, there's specific, like, people want to know specifically what is, like, the origins. Well, how did this guy get to the way he is? You know, what specifically led him this way? You know, is it drugs? Is it alcohol? Was it a bad childhood himself?
Right. I mean, the truthism or whatever, you know, is like hurt people.
Correct.
You know, which, I mean, that's not always the case. Sometimes people have, like, grew up in a great household and they end up being a psycho killer. So
and that's far less that's an outlier out of the pattern. But when they talk about abuse, they talk about it's a pattern, a cycle of abuse. So you're right. Oftentimes people that are abused and hurt oftentimes go on to do the same.
Sure, generational sins, we might call it in the church.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, because it's been normalized, and so for them, hey, this is just the way that you function.
Sure, this is how you interact with other people.
People that get, like, kids that go through divorce with their families oftentimes end up seeing divorce as an okay option in their own lives.
Sure, like that's normal.
Yeah.
Is that what you do?
Exactly.
Things become inconvenient and hard and you just get divorced.
I can go get divorced.
Yep.
We did an episode on divorce, didn't we?
We did, yeah.
Go back and listen to it. It was really good.
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation at a small group with a couple guys who have been divorced, which felt a little weird, basically saying, like, yeah, you know, I don't know if I really buy that. It's best for the kids to not see you fight and be amicable in divorce versus fighting and being married. I don't know if that's I don't know if that's true. That was awkward, but I told them to listen to the podcast and tell me where we get it right and where we get it wrong. We'll see if they listen. Anyway.
Everybody's always an expert on every topic, right?
Yeah.
So there's certainly here's you know, sin is the result of all trauma, and then we have different types of trauma, and we have different reasons for why specific traumas exist. But ultimately, sin is the reason why all trauma happens.
I don't want to derail your thoughts, so bookmark.
Book.
On the road trip we took, I was listening to Katie Faust and Stacey Manning's book, Them Before Us,
Great
which
book.
is amazing.
Great book.
About children's rights, essentially. And some of the stats they brought up were pretty shocking. They're basically saying statistically the person in a child's life that's most likely to protect, nurture, and love a child is their biological dad. The most likely person to abuse them sexually or physically is a male in the household who is not their biological dad, which is usually a stepdad or a boyfriend of the wife.
I hear a lot of that. I hear a lot of that.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
I guess that makes sense, but that's kind of terrifying considering what the huge number of abuse to children at the hands of males living in the household with them that aren't related to that kid.
Shocking statistic.
It's really sad.
But I wouldn't refute it.
Yeah.
Wouldn't refute it. Check out Them Before Us. Absolutely great book, and touches on these types of topics.
Yep.
So all of this has been kind of a big lead up to me sharing a little bit about my own story. And I was trying to think, how do I even jump into this? How do I go through it? And so this is kind of the way that I was thinking about it today. But I found myself about a little over almost 15 years ago now, I think, kind of becoming a statistic, a data point, that I was sexually assaulted. And yeah.
Wait, men can be sexually assaulted?
I know, it's crazy. It's crazy, and I think that's what I was even struggling with. Like, how do I even talk about this on the show? And I was sexually assaulted not by like some random stranger, but I was sexually assaulted by somebody I thought was a friend, and somebody that is a professing believer in Christ.
Do you need more whiskey for this conversation?
I might. But I think I really wanted to talk about it because I know there's other men out there that have trauma in their life, and specifically sexual trauma. Because over the last almost 15 years, I've had to go through my own processing and forgiveness and understanding of God now that this has happened to me. And I'm like, if I can't be the only guy that's been through this. But I think I'm not going to go in the details of the sexual trauma, but I was living with a group of guys, and one of them got really drunk and came into my room while I was sleeping one night and just started doing stuff. And I woke up, and he stopped, and it was only by the hand of God that I did not kill him, because I absolutely wanted to. I literally moved out that night, and I went. I was literally getting married within a month, and so I just moved into my wife's house. We bought a house with her sister and brother-in-law, and this was like back in 2007. So the economy was doing all right, and we were about to, have a big housing burst in 2008. So I moved in, and then I started to go through the process of like, man, what just happened to me?
Yeah.
What? And I even went through the process of like, I don't know that what I went through can be classified as trauma. You were talking,
Really?
Yeah, because I was kind of like, I had kind of this very rigid view of like, well, this is what trauma is. Like if you go to war and you see, really bad stuff, dead bodies, you kill somebody, your soldier friend blows up next to you, that's pretty traumatic.
Sure.
Or maybe another classification like a woman being raped. Like those were kind of my two
buckets.
Yeah, two.
Sure. Trauma is what happens to other people.
Yeah,
not to me.
it was two examples that I had that like what I went through just really didn't kind of fit in either one of those categories.
Was there also an aspect of like, I'm a man and I need to be strong and I'm just being a pussy if I'd like even acknowledge that maybe trauma happened? Or
Oh man, I mean, I can't even tell you how hard it was to go and like share this with other people.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember sharing it with my dad, and he's like, okay, all right, let's. He just kind of went into problem solver mode, you know, and
Sure.
he kind of was just like, all right. He didn't want to necessarily hear it because I think it was probably just too uncomfortable for him to
that'd be
hear.
incredibly uncomfortable, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was uncomfortable for me to experience. It was uncomfortable for me to, you know, talk about with my own dad. I mean, like, I think he was so repulsed by it. He was just like, okay, look. Let's get this thing behind us. Let's move forward. You know.
Sure. I mean, was that helpful to you, or did that just kind of prolong like the processing of it? I mean,
you know, to be quite honest, I think because of what I know about trauma now, I was in kind of a state of shock, mild shock maybe,
Sure.
for, you know, a good couple of years. Because here's the thing, for a lot of people, especially like, you know, women that are raped, and maybe this is a broad generalization, but they don't continue to encounter their perpetrator. Like, oftentimes, maybe not often, I might be making this very broad, but women that are raped, it can be an isolated incident.
Sure.
And then, you know, they don't end up continuously, like on a day-to-day basis, seeing their perpetrator.
Sure.
I know that there probably are examples of that.
I know in the military that's the opposite is pretty common if that happens.
Okay.
Because it's usually someone like in their unit, and you've got the power dynamics of rank and reporting, and they get swept under the rug and all that kind of stuff. But
Okay.
So I guess that's a specific situation.
So for me, the first couple years of kind of living with what happened, I like this friend continued to go to church with me.
So you saw them regularly?
I saw them every Sunday. They'd sit behind me praising God and worshiping God and reading the Bible. And, you know, like, I mean, he got removed from leadership, and the church kind of somewhat put him through counseling and kind of put him on a correction plan.
But not because of that, was it?
It was specifically because of that.
It was, okay. So that was
Yeah.
brought up in the church.
Yeah, but he wasn't
hierarchy.
asked to leave the church. He wasn't asked to, like, hey, go find another church or anything like that, which in a lot of churches, if a wife is being abused, you know, by the husband,
Yeah.
and the church steps in and kind of protects the wife, the husband is asked, hey, you need to go find another church in this kind of healing time.
Sure.
You know, go find another expression. But for me, like, that guy did not find another church. And I don't know that I would have been able to articulate those needs
Sure.
to the church at the time.
So what's your, 15 years removed from that situation? I mean, what are your thoughts on that now? Because it seems like, from the church's perspective, there's kind of this like helping and trying to redeem the person that did that, versus the what's best for the victim of that, and is it continually to wound them having to see them every Sunday in church?
Well, so I know that the church isn't going to have perfect responses, and
Yeah.
so in that way, I have grace. You know, even in the midst of my own pain and even in the midst of my own hurt, I have grace.
Okay.
At least I think what I was displaying was grace, but I mean there was still anger, obviously. But I think the church was right in having an initial response of, wow, that's wrong, that's sin. This individual needs to be removed from leadership. Can't have them, like, they're participating in active,
Yeah.
hidden sin, and they're acting out upon it upon other people. You know, it's like one thing to sin. I don't excuse any sin, but it's one thing to sin when and do it in isolation, and you're really only hurting yourself.
Sure, a quote victimless sin.
Yeah. And it's another thing completely to sin and hurt others, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's even more devastating and more
Sure.
destructive. And so I think that the church was right in their response there, but I don't think the church, and this is more maybe broad commentary on the church's stance when it comes to mental health and relational health. I think that the church oftentimes takes, like, they look at the relationship that people have and the church has in the individuals in the church body, and they say, like, well, we want to reconcile, we want to redeem, and we want to see, rejuvenation,
Sure.
and we want to glorify God. And so I think that oftentimes there's a lot of push for that to happen, but I don't think because of their stance on mental health, they don't look at the potential re-traumatizing they're doing, enforcing or indirectly enforcing or reinforcing people to kind of reconcile in relationship.
So, I mean, that's a lot of words.
It was a lot of words. I apologize.
So, I mean, in a nutshell, from where you are now, would you have wanted a different outcome, at least within the church body? I mean, to me, just kind of my initial reaction is, like, I understand the church wanting to come alongside the sinner in that situation and see repentance and restoration, redemption, all that. But at the same time, is it at the cost of the one who's sinned against, having to, like, see them and deal with them being, there every Sunday? Like, would it have been better for the church to say, hey, we'll do this privately, but you can't be, joining us for Sunday worship?
Yeah, I do think that would have been a better situation. Now, would that have provided, I guess, expedited healing for me, a quicker healing process for me? I don't know, but I can tell you that seeing that man's face every Sunday and still being in community, somewhat, still connected, was hard. I mean, sure. This man then, ended up moving down to the area that we live in now, and I remember he was friends with a lot of the kind of community group members that we were friends with, and I would keep my distance from this guy. If I saw his face, and it would give me panic attacks, and there was. I remember I had one friend who, he kind of confronted me on, why I gave this individual that sexually assaulted me the cold shoulder, because he didn't know the story. He didn't, he kind of started coming down on me, admonishing me and reprimanding me. And I finally just said, hey man, here's the deal. You don't know the story. You don't know the narrative. And I mean, once he found out, he was really unhappy with himself. That he took the stance that he did. He was apologetic, and so I mean, I appreciated that. But I know for me, I would have appreciated the church kind of taking more of an approach of hey, you engaged in the sin, you need to go find another expression of the church.
Sure.
I would have appreciated that. Now, I share this because I know that there's probably men out there that have experienced sexual assault. And, maybe there's shame there, maybe there's, a pushing of it away, maybe it's, caused some depression, anxiety, or some isolation in relationships or panic. But I'm proof that God loves you, loves me. I have wounds from what happened to me, but God was with me every step of the way. Which leads me kind of into, maybe it's my final point, maybe not, I don't know, is where was God during that sexual assault?
I mean, let's bookmark that. I think that's a good note to kind of end on. I mean, is there anything else you want to add to the process? Because we kind of went from, as far as the arc, this thing happened to me, this was the church's response, but I mean, that's 15 years ago. What did the process look like? I mean, and what should it look like if there's, listeners that have experienced that or know people that have, I don't know. I mean, is there I don't know. I don't know if that question's helpful or.
Yeah, I know what you're getting at, because, in thinking about today's topic, I was like, how deep into the weeds do we go here?
Yeah.
Are we doing kind of a flyby? Are we getting a little bit closer to the ground, or are we right on the ground doing this thing? And so I kind of was steering away from kind of talking about my own treatment, because I don't want to be too formulaic and saying hey, if you just follow this, then you'll be all better. Because I've done that in my own clinical counseling with my clients, and you know what? Not every piece of wisdom and not every kind of treatment plan really works for everybody.
Okay.
And so, anywho, in the 15 years, if I'm looking back on it, what has been really, really incredible, helpful to me in my own healing, has been I have a wife that has allowed me the space to talk about it when it comes up. I've had a wife that has encouraged me to talk about it. I've had people in church that know the situation preemptively, talk with me and support me in that way.
Yeah.
And it's allowed for a lot of emotional healing. I've had people check me too, because for a while, like, I'm a people pleaser and I really want to be friends with everybody. I don't want to be in conflict. And I think, there was a point at which, like, this guy that did this to me, he was a good friend. And I was like, you know what? It's an isolated incident. I think we can still be friends. And I had my sister-in-law checked me on that.
Yeah.
She's like, I don't think that's going to happen. And I think that's going to be unhealthy, man. And she was right.
Yeah.
She was right. Because I did try to be friends, but it was re-traumatizing me. Going to counseling, like, I did that.
Okay.
I went to professional counseling, and I was able to, talk through and unearth just stuff that I didn't think was there. So I think that's been some of my process. Talking about it on this show right now is healing.
Sure.
It feels messy, but it feels healing.
Sure. So kind of the idea of, like, bringing what's hidden, out of the darkness into the light, appropriately, because obviously it's not just like, well, here's all the details.
Like, I'm not just meeting somebody for the first time. Hey, my name's Christian. Let me tell you about my trauma.
Right.
Which I know that for some people, that, like, trauma is their identity. My goal is definitely not to wear this as my identity. Like, I definitely know that I've been victimized, but I definitely don't want to walk around as that being my primary identity.
Sure. Like, it's part of your story, but it doesn't define who you are.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I guess the question that comes to my mind is, if I'd imagine going through something like that, the tendency is to keep it to yourself. Be strong, deal with yourself.
Especially as a guy, yeah. It's socially abnormal. Although the rates of male sexual assault are really on the rise.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember when I deployed, to Iraq in 2008, and we're going through some of this, we go through regular, sexual assault training and equal opportunity and all that kind of stuff. And the numbers they had for within the military, it was like 1 in 5 male soldiers will be sexually assaulted. I'm like, no, there's no way. Like 20%, that's crazy.
Yeah.
But I think, there's that stigma behind it. People just don't expect it. Don't know how to deal with it. I mean, it seems like,
or even how to classify it, right? I mean,
sure.
Like I said, I have my buckets of what I think, sexual trauma is.
Sure.
And so I think there are people out there men out there that don't know how to classify what's done to them, because they kind of have this, very, very narrow view of what it is.
Yeah. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like, if this is your experience, or someone, who's had this and their tendencies to keep it themselves, like, it seems like the healthiest thing is, like, if you're married, like, confide in your spouse if you had any. It sounds like from the very get-go,
yeah,
you had Julia to talk with, who, what, you're a month out from being married, and it sounds like she was, definitely a rock in wisdom in you processing and dealing with that from the get-go. It seems like that would be a very healthy way to start. If no one else in your life knows about it, find someone that can be your advocate and walk you through it and help you kind of get outside your head.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a spouse, start there. And hopefully that spouse is kind of a safe place, and space. If that's not the case, then I really encourage you to seek out a trauma counselor. And that's not necessarily a specific title. That's just, a counselor that specializes in trauma, that really kind of understands relationally, clinically, emotionally, how to work with that and how to address that, and really have a long view of what healing looks like. Like, trauma is not going to be like a headache that you have that if you just drink some water or take some aspirin, it's going to be gone in an hour, and expect trauma to change the way that you change the lens and how you see the world, how you interpret interactions, how you trust people, and how you are in relationships with people. Like, that happens.
Sure. So, I mean, kind of in closing this conversation, I mean, where is God in trauma? Where was and is God in your trauma?
So I've, to say the least, struggled and wrestled to answer this question adequately, because I don't have like this example of God like unzipping the fabric of space and time and stepping through in that moment where I'm being traumatized, and him staying, my friend from doing what he did to me. I don't have that like that. And I think that's oftentimes, when going back to that question, why does good things happen, why does bad things happen to good people? People want that kind of example.
Sure.
Well, God brought his hand down and, stop this badness, this
Sure.
evil. Again, we're responsible as human beings for the sin that's happened in our lives. It's God did not cause this trauma.
For the sin that happened to us, or the sin that we commit?
So we're responsible for all sin in the world, but I'm not responsible for the sin that happened to me.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right.
Just want to clarify that.
No. That's worth clarifying. So where was I going with all that? Okay. So the examples that I have of God showing up. So God obviously didn't stop the trauma. I'm obviously talking about it in a past tense. He didn't stop it. But I think that because something happened, there's a tendency for people to believe that God wasn't there. I don't like to think about this, but I don't know how much worse it could have been.
Sure.
But I tend to believe it could have been worse. But that's not to diminish what I went through.
Sure. Do you find that comforting, or is that just kind of a way to a tool to process it?
I don't really find it discomforting or comforting. It's just something.
Okay.
I'm like, okay, it possibly could have been worse. But at the same time, just because the trauma happened doesn't mean that God wasn't there.
Sure.
So where God showed up. So I thought the church had a good response in the beginning, and people came around me immediately. I had a soon-to-be wife that was very accepting and understanding. She had been through her own trauma in her life, and so she knew exactly what I was feeling and experiencing. She could actually put to words some of the stuff that I was struggling. Like initially when it happened for the first year, I felt like dirty. I took a lot of showers.
Sure.
I could not figure out what the heck was going on. I'd never encountered. My wife, though, because she had been through trauma, like ongoing chronic trauma, she was able to put some words to what I was feeling. And so I think God showed up there. I think God showed up in the many community groups and the many people that that were really connected with me. I think God showed up in scripture that I was studying. One scripture that constantly comes to mind, and I want to say I think it's Proverbs. No, I think it's Psalms. God is near the crushed and the brokenhearted. And there's lots of other scripture that has come to mind over the years as I think about my own trauma, but I know God shows up there. I know God gave me a new prayer life. He gave me a new prayer life. Like I started praying differently. I started thinking about praying and communicating with him differently. In all of this, in the 15 years, I don't think that I ever came to God and said, why the heck did you let this happen to me? Like I never, that wasn't my position at all.
Yeah. Would you have anything to say to someone who does have that response?
Why the heck did you let this happen to me? I would encourage, if you're a believer and trauma happened to you and you hold God responsible for it, I would really encourage you to pray specifically about that rather than sitting in anger and obsession and consumption of what happened to you, because that is the danger and temptation of what trauma offers. And so
Sure.
Satan will use anything to get us to be separated from God.
Sure.
Satan tried using my trauma plenty of times to separate me from God. And I know that Satan will use trauma in other people's lives to separate them from God. But if you're a believer and you know about the saving power of Jesus Christ in his life, death, burial, and resurrection, I would start with prayer. And know this, this really needs to be a point, and this was helpful for me, is that Jesus went through a far worse trauma than I did. Again, not to diminish what I went through, but man, I did not die on a cross. I wasn't betrayed. I was betrayed, but I wasn't betrayed like Jesus was, and I wasn't, then publicly mocked and flogged, and then...
Well, you were kind of betrayed. It was a good friend of yours.
I corrected myself just a few seconds ago.
Okay, sorry.
I'm talking really fast.
Okay.
But the betrayal that I experienced wasn't on the same level as what Christ
Sure.
experienced, and then going through what he went through on the cross. I mean, that was intense psychological, spiritual, physical trauma. And so we have a Savior that absolutely understands what trauma is.
Sure. I mean, pretty much anything we can experience as a human that's negative, like, Christ understands that. He empathizes with that. He sympathizes with it, like he's gone through it.
He has, and that's why I say that it's really, I think, a good starting point to go towards prayer, and really specifically offer your trauma, offer your emotions and feelings towards God. And if you're looking for places to start reading in the Bible, go read Psalms, because you see a man in David that is just broken and crying out to God, but he does so in a way that's glorifying to God. In our trauma, Satan wants to tell us, you have a right to be angry at God, and you should raise your fist at God, and you should be angry at God. I actually don't think we have a right to be angry at God. I know that there are preachers and pastors out there that say God has big shoulders and he can take your anger and stuff like that, which I believe is true, but I don't believe we have a right to be angry at God.
It's misplaced. I mean, you're blaming God for something that Satan orchestrated.
Yeah. So the conversation to me, again, because there's obviously it's personal for me. It feels messy. It just feels messy.
Sure.
But my hope is that it might touch somebody, and be helpful to them, in an encouragement on, hey, if you've been through trauma, here's who we have as a Savior. If you've been through trauma, here's an actual personal testimony of somebody who's been through, and God has healed and redeemed, and some of the things you can do. And I don't know. What did you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate you opening up. I mean, it's when we're talking about the possibility of talking about this, a few weeks ago, I'm like, are you sure you want to talk about that? I don't know if I'd have the strength to do that. So I appreciate your vulnerability and being willing to talk about your personal experience, hopefully for the benefit of our listeners. So I appreciate it.
Well, because I did a lot of talking, I'm going to let you close us out.
All right. Well, you know how to find us on the socials. If there's something specific, you need us to oh my, motorcycles. If there's something specific, you want us to pray for you about, or you have questions, you've gone through this. I don't want to speak for Christian, but I'm sure, he'd be happy to answer what he can, point you in the right direction. Yeah, I mean, we're here for you guys, so appreciate you tuning in. This episode is obviously a little heavier than most, but whether our normal jovial, joking, goofy selves or something like this, we're here for you guys. We love you. Thanks for tuning in, and hopefully it's a blessing and encouragement to you.